Hey, this is RockMan. Welcome back to RockMan Reads, a Freakin Book, where DK left off. Today I'll be reading chapters 27 through 29 of Jedi by Michael A. Stackpole. An update on that note from last time. The music is made by DK. It's one of his tracks from his album Spiricia. It's available on his Bandcamp. If you just go to Bandcamp, search for Decreft, that's D-K-R-E-F-F-T, you will find all of his music there, which is wonderful. But anyway, let's get to the book and continue. Chapter 27. From far enough away, the errant venture looked like an Imperial Star Destroyer. There was no mistaking that daggerish shape or the tall bridge. The ship's stark bone-white color and sheer size invoked memories of the days when the Empire's need for discipline often dispatched such ships to punish worlds that harbored rebels. It was truly a sight to behold, and one from which I would have flown as fast as possible if I did not know what the errant venture really was. I brought the headhunter up and around in a loop over midships on the Imp Star. Its normal complement of weapons had been stripped down, leaving it 2 tractor beams, 10 ion cannons, and 10 heavy turbo laser batteries. That amount of firepower left the ship well defended, though as I did a flyby I noticed a couple of the laser batteries were not tracking that well, and at least one froze in the middle as it followed my flight. Coming over the top, I rolled the headhunter and chopped the throttle back. I keyed the comm unit. This is Headhunter 079 requesting permission to board and land. 079, this is Errant Venture Control. Please state the nature of your business. I rolled my eyes. You tell Booster Tarek that he lets me park this fighter on his ship, or he's going to be down more than just 3 turbo laser batteries. Silence reigned on the comm channel for a moment. Then the controller's voice returned with a degree of weariness edging into it. 079, you are clear to land in docking slot 1127. Make sure your weapons are powered down. What? That is the message, 079. I copy. I brought the headhunter in toward the egress bay and powered up the repulsor lift coils. I throttled back to 10% of thrust and slowly worked the fighter into the docking bay. Slot 1127 was back against the bulkhead and would force me to take a long walk around the bay itself to reach Booster's office. If he knew I'd broken my leg, I'd be parking back in the garbage hold and hiking even further. As I closed in on my parking space, the only unusual thing I noticed was that no other ships were parked near me, and the few people on the ground were scurrying away. I ignored them. No one wanted to be caught in the backwash from engine thrust. I concentrated on setting the ship down easily, which I did, giving Booster no reason to complain about my scratching his precious deck. I quickly went through an engine lockdown and provided a security passcode for engine restart. It wouldn't stop anyone from stealing the ship, but it might slow them down. I smiled and keyed in a message on the ignition screen. This headhunter is the property of Mara Jade. Anyone nuts enough to steal it now deserves what he gets. I popped the cockpit hatch, which is when I noticed something rather out of the ordinary. Booster's security detail wore Imperial-style uniforms, but they had light green torsos on the tunics and bright yellow sleeves, bright yellow trousers, and green caps with yellow buttons. Not batons, buttons. The effect was a touch unsettling, especially with such a crowd of them around ship. Their blasters, which were nowhere near as colorful as their uniforms, were all pointed in my direction. A Weequay, whose face looked as if it were made of flaking ceramics, motioned for me to come out of the headhunter. As I stood and my lightsaber came into view, half the guards crouched while the others moved behind convenient cover. I looked around at the dozen of them and shook my head. No trouble, no trouble. For the first time, I really wished I had skill in the area of Jedi levitation, because trying to get out of a fighter that had me a good 3 meters off the deck while my hands were in the air was not an easy thing to do. I would have just jumped out, but my left leg still wasn't 100%, and I didn't want to be limping around on the errant venture. What I ended up doing was sitting on the side of the cockpit and sliding down toward the floor, catching my weight mostly on my right leg. The Weequay jabbed me in the back with a truncheon which, I imagined, could deliver a nasty jolt to me if he only pushed the red button near his thumb. Boss Booster wants you. Good, I want to see him too. Surrender lightsaber. I turned slowly on my heels and faced him, setting myself. Not gonna happen, Quark for brains. He poked me with the truncheon again and hit the button. I felt a tingle of the electricity, but just absorbed it. I smiled as I did so. Power cells are dead. Really, I don't feel a thing. The weak way hit the button again, but my smile did not fade. I bled the energy off into the decking, which raised the fur on the head of a passing Bothan, but none of the guards seemed to notice. The Weequay looked at his stun baton as if it had betrayed him, then pressed his free hand against the tip and hit the button. I snatched the truncheon from the air before it could hit the floor, and looked past the Weequay's twitching form. I reversed the baton and offered the handle to another of the guards. Clearly it's defective. Now, if you will take me to Booster. I turned back to head toward his office when I discovered my quarry had come to me. This wouldn't have been a bad thing, but the flesh of Booster's face was as red as his artificial left eye. He grabbed big handfuls of my green flight suit, hoisted me up off the deck, and slammed me into a bulkhead. Where's my daughter? His short, bristly, white hair and the goatee he'd taken to wearing made him look more like me than I ever even wanted to think about. What have you done with Mirax? I groaned, less from the impact than the sheer fury in his words. Let me explain. He jammed me into the wall again. You think you're that persuasive, Corsac? Booster released me and I fell to the floor. He looked at his guards and shook his head. Fig and Krukar escort him to my office, now. Another Weequay and a fairly scrawny human grabbed my arms, jerked me to my feet, and Rybet marched me off to the wardroom that Booster used as his docking bay office. It felt odd for me to be conducted to his office in the same manner I'd hauled so many prisoners along in my day. I knew that even without using any Jedi techniques, I could break their grips and get rid of them. Because of the unseemliness of being hustled along that way, I almost did make a break. I didn't, because I realized there was no purpose to my doing so. Yes, I might feel embarrassed at being manhandled so, but what difference did it make? Was my pride worth injuring someone? No. They were conducting me to where I wanted to go anyway. What they or anyone else thought of me was really immaterial. I smiled. Some of that Jedi training got through. Reverting to type, I studied my surroundings. The docking bay had plenty of room for ships and approached capacity. The old TIE Fighter launch racks still had a few ties in them, but many of them were missing parts. Other smaller ships had been fitted with unusual suspension collars that allowed them to hang from the racks as well. In that way, Booster was able to fit a lot more ships into his hold. The vast majority of ships in the docking bay were freighters, though few were as big as Mirax's Pulsar Skate or the Millennium Falcon. Most ships of that size couldn't afford docking space on the Errant Venture anyway. The ships present were those of smugglers who dealt in rare, exotic, and high-priced items, or the idle rich who'd found slumming on the Errant Venture something of a thrill. Most of the ships bringing goods for trade and transshipment on the Errant Venture just offloaded their items into one of the supply holds and left the crewman or agent on board, the EV, to handle the transactions. Booster's people brought me to his office, tossed me inside, then shut the hatch. I had to hit a glow panel switch, and when I did, I shuddered. Clutter filled the room, cracked Duraplast boxes leaking streaky red viscous fluids, piles of data cards leaning precariously one against another, chairs filled with cast-off clothing, and in the corner stood a deactivated 3PO droid, festooned with a dozen gun belts complete with blasters. Booster's desk dominated the room and appeared neat in comparison to the rest of it. The single layer of data cards, data pads, wires, and odds and ends had been cleared back from a small cube projecting various holographs of Mirax. I shifted stuff from the chair in front of the desk to the floor and sat, watching the ever-changing display. Though Booster would deny having a single sentimental bone in his body, his projector cube had arranged the images by chronology and subject. They flashed up every 10 seconds or so. The display might follow a theme, like images of Mirax working on the skate, then move along through her life, forward or back, until it shot off again on a themed tangent. It wove a web of her life, a web in which I felt fully ensnared. In watching the display, I realized the detachment I had felt before when she vanished had finally faded. The flash blindness Luke had diagnosed had lifted, and I might have noticed it sooner, but on Yavin 4 I had so little to remind me of her. It was probably just as well that the detachment existed while I started my training, because I would have gotten nowhere while distracted. Now, though, Watching her images, the full weight of her disappearance crashed in on me. I had felt her presence that night in the grotto, and Exar Kun had showed her to me, but I knew I could not trust what I had seen through his power. The fact that I had sensed her when Luke took us on a sojourn through the universe helped sustain me, but now I realized just how alone I felt. And how alone she must be feeling. She was out there somewhere waiting for me to find her, to help her, and I had done nothing. I sighed. Perhaps Booster should have smacked me against the wall even harder. The hatch to the office slid open and Booster stalked in. He looked hard at me, then sat down at his desk. Fire burned in his brown eye, just as brightly as in the electronic one. He watched me, then his head slowly nodded as he pressed his hands flat against the top of his desk. Like a mute referee, Mirax danced from image to image between us. It is for her sake that I don't just twist your head off, Korsek. He kept his voice low and barely under control. She's been missing for how long? I swallowed hard. 10 weeks. 10 weeks! His right fist hammered the desk, making the hollow cube bounce and the data cards ripple like loose tiles in a groundquake. He caught himself and slowly opened his hand. 10 weeks, and you didn't come to me and tell me. I calmed myself, just barely bringing my racing heart under control. My mouth felt dry and tasted like I'd been licking a bantha. 1. I knew then, and know now, your daughter is alive. In consulting with a variety of people, it was determined that keeping knowledge of her disappearance quiet would be the best course. Booster arched a pale eyebrow. It was determined? By whom? What coward decided I shouldn't know my little girl was missing? I raised my chin. I made that decision, Booster. Did you, Korsek? Did you now? Booster sat back. Not your General Kraken, not your Luke Skywalker, not Wedge. You made it? I nodded. I weighed their opinions. I went over the scenarios they suggested and how best to handle the situation. Then I made the decision. So then you'd take full responsibility for it. I could hear in his voice that he was setting a trap for me. You take full responsibility for whatever happens to her. I do. Booster hesitated, then smiled coldly. I think you'll find you don't much care for the consequences of your actions. Something struck me as odd about Booster at that point. He'd managed to fix blame fully and squarely on me, which meant he should have been venting all of his anger and frustration on me, but he wasn't. He'd identified me as a target and had me dead to rights, and he held back. Why? Then the answer slammed into me, and I leaned forward. I accept the consequences of my actions, and you want to know why? Because Mirax is my wife. Our vows make her life and happiness and safety my responsibility, and I've done what I could to acquit that responsibility. I would have liked nothing better than to have headed out after her immediately, but there was nowhere to go, nothing to do. General Kraken and his people were stymied, as was I. All I knew was that your daughter lived, and as long as she lived, I could take the necessary steps to save her. Booster's expression hardened against the challenge in my words. You may think of her as your wife, but she's my daughter, my flesh and blood, which makes me just as responsible for her as you are, Korsek. Don't try to steal that part of my life the way your father stole 5 years from me. If you do, you'll regret it. Maybe, but not in the way you think I will. I narrowed my eyes, and as for your responsibility for Mirax, I just remembered something. In the past 10 weeks, you've never tried to get a message to me asking after Mirax. You never even got a message to Wedge about her. I stood and leaned forward on his desk. All the concern you've showed for her has been from my ship to this office, and that tells me one thing, Booster. You knew. You knew all along that she was working for Kraken to track the Invids, didn't you? She probably worked from here, using the errant venture as her base of operations. Booster laughed slowly. I can see the horn blood run strong in those veins. Very good. His casual admission stunned me. He'd grabbed me, slammed me up against a bulkhead, and all but accused me of having abandoned his daughter to whatever fate her enemies had in mind for her. Part of me wanted to reach across the desk and throttle him, while yet another part wanted to feed my anger through the force and slam him up against the wall. Neither of those parts won in the war for control. Were you just beating up on me for fun? Booster shook his head solemnly. When I realized Mirax was missing and heard you were off playing Jedi games, I was mad enough to come here to Yavin and beat you to within a micron of your life. A great chunk of me still is, but I respect your father enough to think you wouldn't abandon Mirax. Just now, embracing you like this, I gave you a chance to put the blame for your actions on others. You didn't. Got to admire a man who accepts responsibility even when it might hurt. I straightened up, crossing my arms over my chest. And your reason for this little test? I didn't know how much your time down there changed you. I wanted to make sure you could still do what had to be done to save Mirax. What? You don't remember Corellian Jedi Knights, but I do. A bit. I wasn't sure a Jedi would care for my daughter anymore. I stared at him in disbelief. What gets taught at the academy doesn't make students less human. Tell that to the people of Corita. Echoes of their death agony pounded through me. You have a point. Booster nodded. How did you know I was testing you? Attitude and what I sensed about you. Smug satisfaction. I shrugged. You also mentioned General Kraken, and you couldn't have known why I'd be talking to him unless you knew Mirax was working with him. Since I didn't know that, and since she'd not confided in Wedge, I assumed she confided in you. You must have blistered Kraken's ears when you found out she was gone. Booster smiled like Wampa scenting Tauntaun. What a sentence. Told him I'd found a cache of guns to put on this monster before I went hunting for Mirax myself. A fully armed errant venture was one of General Kraken's recurring nightmares, especially with Booster at the helm. Get anything useful from him? Not much, Booster scowled. I know the galaxy is a big place, but she can't have vanished so completely. She hasn't. What do you mean? A woman named Mara Jade. Carday's Confederate? I nodded and sat back down. The same. She said she had inquiries from a rare properties dealer on Nal Hutta about a deal for an item that he'd been holding for Mirax. Mirax had bought an option on purchasing the item, and she was supposed to pick it up within days of when she disappeared. Sounds to me like a legitimate deal she would have set up to bolster her cover when seeking the Invids. Booster smiled. A number of the Invid cruise ships out of Nal Hutta, or used to anyway. Lots have been moving in the last 2 months. Because Mirax's presence was proof positive that the New Republic was looking in that area. The older man stroked his goatee. It's as good a place as any to start. We'll be on our way within the hour. No. Booster frowned at me. No. We have the first lead that's come up and you don't want to follow it up? I want to follow it up, yes, and follow up the more important clue. I laced my fingers together and pressed the index figures against my mustache. Mirax is detected on Nal Hutta, captured, and the Invid crews there scatter. This firmly establishes a link between her capture and the Invids, and it also suggests she's being held to forestall my doing anything rash. You won't be doing it, I will. I shook my head adamantly. Booster, we won't find Mirax until we find the Invidius. And you're not going to have any more luck at finding it than the New Republic has. Tavira's got people who can use the Force. They will know when you're coming, and they'll leave, or worse yet, they'll use their fully armed Imp-Star to blast the venture to scrap. Booster pounded his fist in his open hand. She's my daughter, Corsac. I have to do something. I know that. She's my wife, and I have to do something too. I have to act, but not before I'm ready. I leaned forward. Meet me halfway, Booster. If you don't, she'll die, and neither one of us will be happy for the rest of our lives. In your case, that won't be long, because I'll kill you. Booster scoffed. You'll try. There is no try, Booster. I let the edge bleed out of my voice. I need you to do 2 things. First, use your network and get me as much data as you can about the Invid crews. I want to know who is shipping on what and out of where. If it gets to a point where we have a hit, I want to make sure we hit hard and hurt them badly. Done. Booster smiled. Carday may think he's the data lord of the New Republic, but I've flipped bits he's not even aware exist. Good. My father-in-law picked up the holocube and froze a recent shot of Mirax, so she smiled at both of us. What's the other thing? I tried to sound nonchalant. Get me into Corellia and out again? Booster lost his grip on the holocube, dropping it to the desk. Get you in past the Dictat's watchman and out again? Have you lost what little mind you have? I hope not, because if I have, neither one of us will see your daughter again. I stood and held my lightsaber aloft. It's going to be a Corellian Jedi that saves your daughter, and unless I get home and back out again, there's just flat out aren't going to be any Corellian Jedi around to do the job. Chapter 28. My perspective as a member of the Corellian Security Force, had never really led me to a proper appreciation for how well Booster Tarek operated. Our animosity had shielded me from his professionalism. Now, with his being galvanized by his effort to find and save his daughter, Booster pushed himself into overdrive, with truly remarkable results. Securing for me false identification documents took less time than I would have imagined. Booster's people accessed a database of pre-existing data phantoms and merely attached my holograms to them. Using the destroyer's own Imperial issue document fabrication machinery, I had 3 sets of documents in no time. One for getting me onto Corellia, one for walking around on Corellia, and a third for getting me back off. I smiled. The Rebellion's insertion of Rogue Squadron onto Coruscant hadn't provided documentation this good. After that, Booster sent me to the middle of the 3 luxury deck levels on board. These decks were each fitted out with a variety of establishments suited to the clientele allowed access to them. The lowest of the decks made pest holes like Mos Eisley look luxurious. On Black Level, the denizens consisted mostly of out-of-work crews, poor folks looking for cheap transit, criminals, petty thieves, swindlers, and conmen. I'm not exactly certain why Booster allowed them on his ship, but even they might have information he could sell elsewhere. Blue Level, where he sent me, was a bit more respectable than Treasure Ship Row down in Coronet City and Corellia. I saw just enough unsavory characters, Boba Fett wannabes, Han Solo wannabes, and, albeit too few, Princess Leia wannabes. Mostly I saw traders and dealers and adventurous sorts who seemed to find shipping aboard a fearsome Star Destroyer thrilling, and Trader's Alley, the cash-only bazaar, meant one could always find something thrilling here. Of major import on this level was the central courtyard area. It actually linked up with Diamond Level above it through a massive refitting effort that cored through 3 decks in the heart of the ship. In this airy well each day was displayed a brilliant holographic presentation of the Thyphera campaign. I noticed that Booster's role and that of the Errant Venture were expanded and that my role was all but eliminated. That niggled a little bit, but I decided that presentation was theatrical, not historical, so hyperbole was bound to creep in. On Blue Level 1, I visited a tailor who scanned me and started fabricating clothes that would fit my identities. I had him double-check the measurement on my collar. It would have been just like Booster to have him trim 3 or 6 centimeters off, so I choked my way through my trip. The tailor, a Celestin, cheebled at me that he'd never do such a thing. Proper fit was his stock in trade, after all. Booster's final effort to get me onto Corellia was a masterwork. He wouldn't even let me up on Diamond Level. He said just having someone from Corsic on Blue Level was dampening the hedonistic abandon of luxury passengers, but he found me help up there. He convinced a Corellian couple that the only real way to feel the illicit thrill of being a smuggler was trying to smuggle something onto Corellia. He went so far as to say that even though they were Corellians, he didn't think they could pull it off. They demanded he let them try. He demurred. They pressed. He relented after they bribed him, and even thanked him for finding them replacement crew members for 2 of their yacht crew who had run into trouble in a Black Level entertainment establishment. I had no idea what the couple was smuggling, aside from me, but watching them pretend to be smugglers was rather amusing. When we arrived at the Coronet City spaceport, they decided to brazen out their effort by dumping a hefty bribe on the customs inspector who greeted them. The inspector, taken aback by the bribe, began to question them closely. His colleagues in immigration were intrigued with what was going on and undoubtedly wanted their share of the bribe, so they passed the crew through without more than cursory glances at our identification, then zeroed in on the couple. Shouldering my 2 satchels of clothing and equipment, I departed the spaceport and found a fairly clean transient housing facility just off Treasure Ship Row. Despite my having worked the row in years past, I wasn't worried about running into old colleagues and being discovered. Corsic had changed through the years. It wasn't even the Corellian security force anymore. The Diktat had morphed it into the Public Safety Service and had exchanged the traditional emerald and black uniforms for something darker and more imperialistic. The PSS's mission had become more snoopy and more concerned with maintaining public order than solving crimes. The past I knew here is dead. A shiver ran down my spine. Treasure Ship Row had changed in the 6 years I'd been away. It had always been seedy and disreputable, but the bright lights had provided a carnival veneer to the whole place. People of all types had been able to come here and find amusement. Certainly there were places good and respectful folks didn't go, except by accident. but the slight air of menace made the jaunts here more memorable, much like shipping aboard the errant Venture. The changes on Treasure Ship Row might have seemed an improvement to many. The main street had been cleaned up considerably. All the paint was fresh, and graffiti was obliterated before it had time to dry. The lighting appeared less garish, and the establishments were milder in tone. It had moved from being a place to being a show place, leaving it artificial and shallow. Out and around it, in the area that had not been transformed, the shadows had deepened and the menace festered, until anyone venturing a block away from the safe zone would drown in reality. The government, in cleaning up Treasure Ship Row, clearly believed it had gotten rid of all the unsociable elements that used to call it home, and was using the Public Safety Service to insulate themselves from reality and its consequences. The only positive point about the change was that I found it very easy to hire a speeder cab. I gave him the directions to my grandfather's home, and the driver, a Klatooinian, graced me with a smile that was all tooth. Is that a reference to Klaatu Barada Nikto? I wonder. I sank back into the rear seat, but refrained from drawing in a deep breath to relax myself. A Jedi might not know pain, but the sense in the back seat of a speeder cab could gag a Gamorrean. I hoped I was not on a fool's errand. While in the back-to-tank, I had realized that I'd taken my father's message to be encouragement to join the Jedi Academy. What Luke had told me about the Force allowing one to see pieces of the past or present or future suggested my father had somehow known the Academy would come into being. That was an unwarranted assumption. Moreover, my father always hedged his bets. Knowing the future was mutable, he couldn't be certain the Academy would exist. As a result, I had to assume that he had made arrangements for information to be left behind for me so I could recover my heritage. I smiled slowly. Even if my father had left nothing behind, seeing my grandfather again would be fun. Nearing his home, back in the Hill District where I had grown up, I began to realize how much I missed him and Corellia. I had gone away, had been forced to flee, to avoid imperial entanglements and death. From that point, I had pretty much been in hiding, or up to my neck in missions with Rogue Squadron. While we had exchanged holographic greetings, the Diktat's censors had chopped the messages up enough that little of my grandfather's wit or warmth had gotten through. The speeder cab came to a halt at a gate that blocked the whole street on which I'd grown up. My father had purchased a house across a circle from my grandfather, and there had been 8 other houses scattered around that circle. We'd never had a wall surrounding the area, and certainly no gate. Are you sure this is the right place? The Klatooinian nodded and tapped the display unit on his vehicle's local navicomp. He reached out, plucked a wired comlink from its holder beside the gate, and threaded it back to me. Hello? The stiff and formal voice answered back. The Horn Estate? Estate? I'd like to speak with Rostek Horn, please. Director Horn has asked not to be disturbed. I ducked my head and tried to peer through the gate's bars at the houses further in, but I couldn't see my grandfather's place, nor could I see the home I'd grown up in. Instead, all I could see was a huge, sprawling building of very recent manufacture. It gleamed brightly against the green of the hills behind it, all white and silvery, where tinted, transparent steel sheets took the place of walls. Please, tell him it's his... I hesitated. If I said grandson, I could cause trouble since I still had murder warrants out for me in the Corellian system. Tell him it's an old friend, here in Halcyon. Director Horn knows no one by that name. I put an edge into my voice. You clearly have not been with him long. I grew up in this neighborhood. He was like a grandfather to me. Tell him that. Just a moment. The Klaatu... I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Klatooinian. The Klatooinian passed the time by bringing me up to speed on the local Zone Ball League standings. He tried to impress me with the fact that Stave Pedson, the local star, who, did I know, had once been romantically linked with Princess Leia, had sat where I sat. I was assured the athlete was not as handsome as I was, but the Klatooinian remembered him because he was a most generous tipper. I smiled back at my driver and nodded, but before he could regale me with Pedston's latest scoring coup, the gate opened. The Klatooinian hit the accelerator, which jolted us forward and tore the wired comlink from my hands. It clipped him in the back of the head as it snapped out his window. He grumbled a bit as he rubbed at the rising lump, but managed to run me up to the estate's front door without further incident. I paid him off and tipped him very well. It was Brewster's money, after all, and I was pretty sure it wasn't counterfeit. Once outside the speeder, I realized that the distant view of the building had failed to convey its actual size. My grandfather's house had only ever been a modest two-story affair, with all the spare capital and his spare time going into maintaining the gorgeous sunken gardens in the back. The building I stood before now occupied 3 times the footprint of the old house, and rose another whole level above the old house's roof. In its construction I could see bits and pieces of things my grandfather would love, but if he'd had the money to build this house, he would have just expanded his gardens even further instead. I walked up to the door, but before I could ring the bell, a small wiry man with olive skin pulled the door open. He wore a black uniform, festooned with white buttons. White gloves encased his hands, and he eyed me suspiciously. He gave me no smile and looked me over carefully before he stepped aside and let me into the home's grand foyer. The man spoke in the same clipped tones I'd heard over the comlink. "Director Horn is waiting for you in the garden." He set off at a brisk pace, his shoes clicking sharply against the rose and black granite flooring. In the center of it, fashioned out of black marble and slices of malachite, the old Corsac logo had been rendered beautifully. I hopped over it, breaking my stride, which brought the man's head back around to see what I was doing. It didn't surprise me that my grandfather was in the garden. When he retired, he said he wanted to dig and plant there until he was dug in and planted. After a long walk, we emerged onto a veranda that was amply shaded from the noontime sun. Beyond it, down a short green pathway leading to a central fountain within an amphitheater of colorful flower beds, stood my grandfather. Taller than me, taller even than my father had been, Rostek Horn had a lean, aristocratic bearing about him. Despite his age, his white hair grew in full and thick, his gray eyes never seemed to rest, and while I had only ever seen love and affection in them, colleagues who had chanced to be disciplined by my grandfather said they could be colder than the darkest ice ball in the galaxy. While he seemed thinner than when I had last seen him, he was no less vital, and for the first time I saw him as the predator colleagues had reported he could be. What struck me as most unusual was that there he stood, full in the noon sun, wearing a formal black suit with a high stiff collar. He was not dressed for a day in the garden, but a day dealing with a variety of things that had occupied him during his days with Corsac. With his right flank toward me, providing less of a target perhaps, he brought his head around to look at me. Those cold gray eyes sent a jolt through me. I started past my guide and onto the path, but the small man pressed a hand against my stomach, stopping me. I looked at my grandfather and half closed my eyes. I projected into his mind an image of my running and screaming and falling and laughing as a child on the same expanse of green that separated us now, one from another. Opening my eyes fully, I said, "It has been a long time, Director. Perhaps you do not remember me." My grandfather remained rock still for a moment, then nodded. "Tosruk, he is known to me. You are dismissed." Tosruk's brown eyes narrowed. He scanned cleanly on his approach, but he might have skills. "I have nothing to fear from Halcyon here, do I?" I shook my head. "No, sir." My grandfather smiled slowly. "You see, Tosruk, I am safe. Go about your other duties. Have the cook prepare us a light luncheon, and I mean light, not just with less gravy." Tosruk snapped his head forward in a bow, then spun on his heel and retreated. I approached my grandfather slowly, not daring to break into the run I would have preferred to use in greeting him. I extended my hand to him and he took it, then pulled me into a firm hug. I wanted to say something, but I felt a lump rise in my throat and tears beginning to fill my eyes. He pulled back and held me out at arm's length. "Emperor's black bones, you shouldn't be here." I had to come. I've been away too long. I glanced back at the house. Many changes. My grandfather's smile broadened, and a sinister laugh accompanied it. "Yes, there have been many changes." He waved me toward the greenhouse across the far side of the garden. "If you would join me, I'll show you some of my newer efforts, prize winners all." I dropped into step with him and said nothing until we had reached the greenhouse and stepped inside. My grandfather stripped off his jacket and hung it on a peg inside the doorway. He flipped a couple of switches and glow panels went on with all but one of them. The rising illumination revealed row after row of potting benches covered with seedlings, all the way to the back to the small bay of machines he had used for genetically manipulating flowers for color and size of blossom. He gave me a cautious grin. "We're safe to speak in here. I have it swept each week." "Good." I glanced back at the house. "What happened to your house?" You may recall I had something of a reputation for maintaining all sorts of files on local politicians, imperial liaisons, and the like. When Corsac became the Public Safety Service, it was determined that my files would be an embarrassment. It was further assumed that I had them in the house. A mysterious fire consumed the house, and then the house you grew up in. He kept his voice low, but full of curious tones that suggested he found the fire somewhat funny. What they discovered was that there were multiple copies of my files all over, in computer systems new and old. The encryption keys were what they lacked. A few people suddenly found interesting files on activities they would have preferred to keep hidden, arriving on data cards in their homes, usually accompanied by a flower or two that were easily identified as a hybrid I'd created. The implications were clear, so in recompense for my long years of service to Corsac, and to protect me, since now I am considered a treasure for my horticultural skills, the government bought up and ceded to me all this land. They built my new home and filled it with all sorts of interesting mechanical listening devices and scanners. Tosruck and the rest of the staff report regularly to petty officials, though those officials don't realize that the staff's loyalty is to me. The very files used by the officials to choose staffers who could be manipulated were files I created. I laughed aloud. "I thought when you retired you wanted to leave all this sort of thing behind." He nodded. "I would have been more than happy to, but others who want power were not content to leave me alone. Unfortunately, they have neither the grace nor the sense for me to leave them alone either." He reached out and caressed the leaves of a small plant. "Now I can send a seedling to someone with a note suggesting that I had read of this opinion or that which he holds. If I say I am disappointed, their thinking tends to be modified. If I say I support them, they move more strongly in that direction. I choose my targets and my issues carefully. I seek to curb the excesses of the young and the foolish, or old and foolish. There's even talk among the shadowy cabal of pundits who advise leaders about what it means for me to send a live plant versus a cut bouquet, or the true significance of a night-blooming flower versus something that blooms once and dies." My grandfather smiled at me. "But you didn't come here to ask after my gardens or to listen to me natter on about warping the small minds of politicians, did you? I'm happy to see you, of course, and I do want to hear about your life and tell you about mine." His smile broadened indulgently. "The name you chose to greet me and what you did out there tells me why you are here. You want to know what your father left behind for you, don't you?" I nodded slowly. "You don't mind?" My grandfather looked at me with surprise, then laughed. "Mind? My dear boy, I've spent nearly the last half-century preserving your heritage for you and for your father. I would have been disappointed if this day had never come." I smiled. "Would you have sent me a flower to let me know how disappointed you are?" "I would have sent you many, many flowers." He opened his arms to take in the greenhouse and the gardens. "These flowers, Corin, are the Halcyon heritage. Where better to store knowledge of the Jedi and the Force than in things that live?" I gotta tell you, when I first read this book and the parts before, I always felt like Corin was getting very cocky in a lot of situations. And like I said, I was also getting confused by the pace of this book and where it's going. My thinking was that he was going to go to the Jedi Academy and become a Jedi, and then he was going to save Mirax. But now he spent 10 weeks doing that, and then he decides to leave, and Booster's like, "What are you doing? It's been 10 weeks. And now he's going to his old home and seeing his grandfather. And obviously I don't know much about Corin's backstory about why he had murder warrants out on him or anything. But rereading this and knowing what it is about his grandfather, the story is very funny about the grandfather, having all this dirt on the politicians and basically blackmailing them into building him a house and gardens and everything, and now they treat him with respect because they're afraid of him. It's awesome and hilarious at the same time. And knowing where this is going, I'm enjoying it. But excuse me, we have one more chapter to read, so let's move on till chapter 29 here. I watched my grandfather closely because I didn't quite understand what he'd said. He was old and could be losing it, though I'd seen no evidence of that so far. Your comments are sailing right past me. He laughed delightedly, a deep, rich sound I'd remembered very well. Don't feel disappointed, Corin. I had to come up with a storage system that would befuddle even the most diligent of investigators. Come with me. I followed him toward the rear of the greenhouse to the computers and genetic manipulation processors. You probably do not recall this from your schooling, but the genetic code in many life forms consists of 4 nucleotides arranged in pairs. They provide a genetic blueprint that produces what we are. I nodded. I know. Imps messed around with genetics to produce the Krytos virus. Yes, a nasty piece of work, that. My grandfather keyed something into the computer, and the attached holopad showed me a double helix slowly revolving in the air. It looked like 2 twisting ladders spiraling around each other. What most people fail to realize is that while genes are very small, they consist of a vast number of these base pairs of nucleotides. What they also don't know is that much of the coding for any gene is redundant, and genes are often filled with pieces of nonsense coding or bits of coding left over by evolution. These inconsequential bits of code are essentially inert and useless. What I've done is to manufacture replacement strings of base pairs to put in their place. These replacement strings use one pair to represent 0 and another to represent 1. I stared at him gap-mouthed. You digitized data and inserted it into the genetic material of a plant, allowing the plants to duplicate the code with every cell division. Correct. While random mutations might destroy little bits of the data, there are so many samples out there that comparing them will fill in any gaps. He smiled broadly. I recall at least one Jedi hunter coming here and asking for some basic plant stock for his garden back on Imperial Center. I gave him as much as he wanted of my Jedi line. My eyes narrowed. The flowers you sent to politicians, they contain the decryption keys to the files that concern them, don't they? I must amuse myself, mustn't I? He rolled up his sleeves. I spent enough time with Najah to know that the Jedi considered nothing coincidental. I knew if I put the Jedi information into these plants and ensured their distribution, the information would be discovered again. At the time I started, I thought the discovery would not happen in my lifetime, but I wanted it available. I smiled. I want you to tell me about him, about Najah. I will. He looked at me and shook his head again. Your appearance, I didn't know you at first. Your father had a saying, one he picked up from his father. Do you recall it? If you cannot recognize the man in the mirror, it is time to step back and see when you stopped being yourself. I nodded. I remember. Well, seeing you now, I must have you tell me who you have become. He pointed back at the house. First, however, we will have something to eat. Then you'll join me turning the compost pile. More data hidden in there? He winked at me. I think you will find the work rewarding. We talked mostly of his flowers and the way the neighborhood had been in the old days. Because his household staff bustled in and out, Corin Horn was referenced to in third person, as if Kieran Halcyon had been a playmate of his. By rights, I guess, I should have found the subterfuge awkward, but I slipped into the Halcyon role the way I would have slipped into any undercover identity. It was a game we shared, and both took great delight in it. Grandfather dispatched Tosruk to my hotel to pick up my things, while the two of us went out to the compost heap armed with shovels. My grandfather directed me toward a pile of bantha dung that he used for fertilizer. Or as Java would say, bantha poodoo. He'd been getting it from the Coronet City Zoological and Botanical Gardens for longer than I could remember, in exchange for providing them with his latest hybrids. Dig deep and shift the pile over this way about 3 meters. Leaning on a shovel, wearing bibbed splatter slacks and knee-high rubber boots, he smiled at me. If you can shift it any other way, feel free. I shook my head. I could make you think it had moved. Halcyons always have been notoriously weak in the telekinetic skills area, he laughed. Dice were the only game of chance in which I felt safe playing against Najah. Someday I aspired to making dice move with the Force. My grandfather smiled. The Halcyons have their strengths. The mental projection you allude to was something Najah did very well. He also could absorb energy. I was told this was a very rare ability among Jedi. I nodded. That's what I've heard as well. Well, without telekinesis, I guess I'll have to use this shovel and elbow grease to move that pile. As I dug, my grandfather told me tales of Najah Halcyon. We worked together for a good long time, or so it seemed, before he was called away to the Clone Wars. Our partnership was only 10 years or so, as I recall. I guess I was 7 years older than you are when you left. He was a bit older than me and his wife. I'd grown up living near Skara, so I knew her quite well before they ever met. Your father was only 10 at the time Najah left, but had been working with Najah for years to develop his skills. I swiped at the sweat on my brow. Najah died in the Clone Wars, right? Actually, he died shortly thereafter, before he could ever return home. He and I had joked about his going off to the Clone Wars, for it was said that a Corellian Jedi who leaves the system does so at his own peril. My grandfather's eyes clouded over. Najah promised his wife and me that the Clone Wars would not kill him. He was right, but still suffered the fate of those Corellian Jedi who go away. A friend of his, a Kamasai Jedi named Yelenik Itkla, came here, bringing Najah's effects home. He apologized for not bringing Najah's body, but the bodies of Jedi Masters fade away upon death. He also didn't have Najah's lightsaber. He said the Galactic Museum had asked for it for their Jedi collection. He smiled slightly. I suppose it is still there. I shook my head. Nope. It has served me well on a couple of occasions, saved my life. He clapped his hands, and mine as well. Thieves run in fright from its silvery light. I used to kid Najah about that. I smiled, but kept digging. He used to go out with you when you worked cases. All the time. Most often he would be dressed in street clothes just like me. He found a lot of people were wary of the Jedi and afraid of them. Without them knowing who he was, he could help victims. When it came time for us to go after criminals, he'd don his cloak in more traditional Jedi garb. Skara used to refer to it as his hunting clothes. Criminals learned it didn't hurt as much if they didn't resist, so we were able to defuse many a tense situation just by having him show up as a Jedi. Of course, stories of what he had done spread throughout the underworld and became quickly exaggerated, so people reacted to his image and reputation, not reality. I cleared the area my grandfather had indicated and peeled back the plasticized tarpaulin that had been beneath the dung heap. I noticed on the underside a metallic sheen. This is a diffuser pad? Is it? I hadn't noticed. I frowned. Diffusers came in all different shapes and sizes and simply channeled the energy from scanners away so return signals from scanners would not reveal what was hidden by the diffuser. Smugglers regularly used them to prevent cursory searches from uncovering contraband, but a little time and a little effort made finding the diffusers easy, and finding one of them meant finding whatever they covered. In this case, the diffuser covered a bare patch of ground. Let me guess, a buried door that no one has found because they didn't want to dig through bantha dung? See, it was effort like that which allowed your father to catch Booster Tarek. Not a surprise the man hated the horns. He's got more reason now. My grandfather smiled. Yes, how does he like having his daughter married to a horn? I turned one spadeful of dirt, then looked at my grandfather with surprise. You know? Corin, I love you dearly, and I think you will recall that we spent many long hours discussing your love life and the disasters attendant thereunto. Don't remind me, I growled at him. Hey, is that just a leaning shovel, or can it dig too? It can dig. Do you want to use it? Is yours worn out? I arched an eyebrow at him. You're not going to help? I did my part in burying it. His smile slackened slightly. Get going. It's not that far down. Back to the point. When your garbled missives coming to me stopped mentioning romantic difficulties, I assumed you had found someone. I made inquiries. And you're not disappointed? Disappointed? Why would I be? She's Booster Tarek's daughter. My grandfather walked over and rested his right hand on the back of my neck. Corin, if she was enough to win your heart and keep it, she has to be wonderful. I am happy for you truly. Someday you will bring her here so I can meet her. Sure, as soon as the murder warrants for me are lifted. He frowned. Oh yes, Gil Baster's work. I'll take care of that. Perhaps that Imperial liaison officer you had should be found guilty. Lure, he's dead. So much the better. He glanced down at the hole at my shovel as my shovel hit metal. There you go. I cleared the hole. Old storm cellar? It was here when I bought the house. He crouched and helped me tug the metal door open. It's rather snug down there. You can go first. He pulled a glow rod from his back pocket, flicked it on, and handed it to me. I clambered down the rusty ladder built into the side of the Duracrete shaft. At the bottom, the enclosure opened out into the area beneath the dung heap. The boxy room had been cleared of everything save one dusty and dirty old fiberplast trunk. It appeared to be one of the sort I'd seen used by a lot of smugglers. Old pre-imperial military surplus, cheap and in ready supply. I heard my grandfather come down behind me. "This trunk, what is it?" When the Empire decided all Jedi must die, I made some decisions. Some, like altering files to hide your grandmother and father from Imperial hunters, were good decisions. I did not regret them in the least. I glanced back at him. "Were there other Corellian Jedi families you hid?" "That's not information you need to know, Corran. If there are any, and if they are meant to be found, they will be." His hands rested on my shoulders. Other decisions were risky. I chose foolishly to put my family and myself in jeopardy by hiding this down here. Had it been discovered, I could have gotten all of us killed. By rights, I should have destroyed it. Your grandmother and father thought I had because I told them that, but I just couldn't. His hands gave my shoulders a squeeze. "There in that box are all the things Yelenik Itkla brought back here after Nedja's death." I nodded slowly, the light bobbing up and down over the packing case's dark bulk. "How did Nedja die?" "I don't know the details. The Kamasi asked that I not inquire. What he did tell me was that a great man, a hero of the Clone Wars, selected them for a very special and honorable mission. They went with him, and the three of them vanquished most deadly foes, but Nedja was mortally wounded. All the Jedi healing techniques could not save him, and he died." Whoa, Jedi healing techniques. I think I've seen those in some recent movies. "Then you married his wife and adopted his son." My grandfather's voice grew distant. I'd known Skara all my life. We'd always been good friends, and we both lost our best friend at the same time. Our shared grief brought us more closely together, and our shared lives provided us with strong roots together. I have always chosen to think that Nedja had an inkling of his fate and what would happen to us after his passing. I like to think knowing his friends would salvage love out of their mourning made his death that much easier. He patted me on the shoulder. "The dust down here has my eyes watering. I'm going to head back up. We can pull the chest out of here if you want, or you can open it and just look at the things here. Your choice. You are the last Halcyon, so they belong to you." "Thank you." I took a step toward the case, then turned and faced my grandfather. "You're wrong in one thing, though." Tears glistened in the half-light. "Am I?" I nodded. "I don't see myself as the last Halcyon. I'm the last Horn. I just hope in this chest and in the garden above there's everything I need to guarantee both lines will continue." Excuse me. Alone in the still darkness, I opened the trunk. Dust trickled down from the lid, filling the air. I expected a musty odor of old clothes that had long since mildewed away to nothing, but instead I found a chest packed neatly and tightly. All the clothing had been folded precisely and sealed in clear plastine pouches. I carefully pulled one after another out, but opened none of them. Still, from what I could see in the glow rod light, the clothes had all been laundered, leading me to suspect the Kamasi Jedi had taken great pains to care for his friend's efforts. Toward the bottom of the trunk, I found boots encased in plastine, as well as a cloak and blanket similarly pouched. Below that, I saw the lid of a hinged compartment that I lifted up. Inside it was thick foam padding with hollowed spaces for various items. I easily recognized the slot meant for Nedja's lightsaber. A small first aid kit, a shaving kit, and a set of eating utensils all sat in their appropriate slots. Odd coins filled other slots, as did power packs for a variety of items and a positively antique comlink. What immediately attracted my attention, however, was the rectangular slot filled with static holograms. I fished them out and carried them back over to where the sun's light filtered down through the long chimney. One by one I flipped through them and found myself smiling, though I recognized no one. I figured out which person had to be Nedja after a couple of shots. From other items in the picture, especially the lightsaber clipped to his belt, I could tell he'd stood slightly taller than me, but no taller than my father, and he had my trim build. We didn't really look that much alike, except around the eyes and chin. Still, he stood there easily and openly, feet shoulder-width apart, hands open, a smile on his face and life in his eyes. I recognized in his stance the way my father used to stand around, and knew I'd adopted the same stance as well. The other figure I found easy to recognize was a Kamasi. Golden down covered him except around the eyes, where purple fur formed a mask around his eyes that spread tendrils up and back to stripe his skull. The Kamasi's large dark eyes seemed full of inquisitiveness, not the sadness marking the Kamasi I'd seen. But then I'd only seen Kamasi rarely, and this shot had been taken before they'd almost all been wiped out. The two of them, my grandfather and his friend, looked weary in some shots, but that was to be expected of people fighting a war. That they also looked content spoke a lot about their commitment to keeping the galaxy safe. Some of the shots had people I recognized in them. I saw a very young Jan Dodana standing with Najah. I recalled the general having asked me in Lusankia if he knew my grandfather. He had indeed known him, but I had not known who my grandfather was at the time. Jan saved my life in that prison. Had he saved yours too, Najah, or was he paying back some ancient debt to you when he saved mine? Bail Organa appeared in one picture with Najah and the Kamasi. Other individuals joined them in group and individual shots, but I didn't positively identify any of the others. The old-style clothes, the youthful faces, could easily have been countless senators and leaders whose aged faces I would have easily recognized. Some struck me as very familiar, annoyingly so, but without someone to tell me who they were or images to use for comparison, I was stuck not knowing. Suddenly the war holograms ended, and I found myself looking at peacetime shots. The first showed my grandfather standing there with Najah. Najah was handing him one of the Jedi medallions marking Najah's elevation to the rank of master. Then I saw Najah with his face pressed cheek to cheek with that of my grandmother. It shocked me because I'd only ever seen her with my grandfather Rostek. Then, in a picture where the image ran wider, I saw Skara, Najah, and a boy who would become my father. I sagged against the wall and shut my eyes against tears. During my life, I'd long heard the cries of downtrodden people who kept saying the Empire was robbing them of their lives and their dignity and the rights they deserved by the simple virtue of their sapience. I'd listened, but not too closely, because I found their arguments weak and self-serving. They'd always warned me that someday it would be my turn, that the stormtroopers would be coming for me, and that day it would be too late. I laughed at them then because with my family I'd never imagined the Empire could hurt us. But hurt us it had. The Empire hadn't even existed when Najah died, but the actions of the Emperor forced my grandfather and grandmother to live a lie. Fear of discovery had to have nibbled on my grandfather every day of his life. Knowing he had saved people might have been an antidote for that, but having to endure that fear for so very long, was incredible. My respect for him doubled and doubled again. He is a hero who would never be celebrated for what he had done, and there must be more people like him throughout the galaxy, heroes unsung from a dark time. I slipped the holograms into my pocket, then returned and replaced everything save the Corellian Jedi uniform, cloak, and boots in the box. I resealed it, then carried my booty out and hid it in the greenhouse. I closed the storm cellar and reburied it, laying back down the diffuser pad and shoveling the manure back over it. My grandfather joined me as I finished the job. Find anything of interest down there? I nodded. A past I never knew about. I gave him a brave smile and renewed respect for someone who proved himself a better friend than anyone could ever hope to have. His eyes misted over for a moment, then he smiled and nodded slowly. Busy day, then. You have a lot to think about. I smiled. I do, but that can wait. Right now, a grandson would like to spend time with his grandfather, potting plants, delivering flowers, cruising Treasure Ship Row looking for trouble. What do you think? Rostek Horn smiled broadly and threw an arm over my shoulder. I think Coronet City is in for some excitement. It's been a while since two horn men made their presence felt. It'll be a night to remember. End of chapter 29. Yeah, as I was reading that, I was remembering things that are going to happen later. But that later will be for a different time. I will see you next time, whenever that is, when I can continue reading the Freakin Book, I Jedi.